Hi, Lou here to talk about why cooperative board games have struck my fancy as a designer. Well, in games, interactive usually amounts to confrontational. Not always, but frequently. If the game is highly interactive between players, then they can do a lot to mess with each other, and that's what tends to cause confrontation. Now, the Euro-style games are usually non-interactive to a great degree. They're parallel competitions. Each person does his own thing most or all of the time, and this is more puzzle than game. Well, co-ops, as they exist now, tend to be puzzles to a greater or lesser extent because there's no human opposition, and because they tend to be designed by people who design Euro-style games. But there's nothing to prevent a co-op game from being highly interactive, and yet not confrontational because you're all on the same side. So if you want high interactivity in a non-confrontational, non-parallel competition game, co-ops are where it's at. Now, role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, are the ultimate co-op. You have human-controlled opposition, but it's not you against the GM or the referee. The GM is neutral. Actually, the GM is biased in your favor. Co-op war games, or what you might call historical fictional strategy games, are okay for many players who would otherwise object to the confrontation because you're all on the same side. So we come as close to the ideal, which is old school Dungeons and Dragons, as possible without a GM in these cooperative board games. GMs being the exception in board games. You hardly ever have a GM. The question is, how good can the non-player opponent be without use of a computer and computer programming? War games tend to be more complex than, say, epidemics like in Pandemic. Well, board games have to use cards or dice tables to determine the activity of the non-player opponent, and there's not much to work with there. There's not a lot of variety, there's not a lot of smarts, you're not likely to have if-then-else conditions and so on. It's limited, in other words. So you need usable situations. And an obvious usable situation is where semi-random activity by the non-player fits the history or the story, such as Viking or other raiding. Or where an overall direction of movement works, as in my co-op space war game, where the enemy goes for the homeworlds of the players and destroys all life along the way. Defense is more difficult for card programming to do well. It's easier for card programming to do attacking. And there are plenty of invading and raiding scenarios in history. Now, what about card games as opposed to board games? Well, it's hard to begin with to make a pure card game that has maneuver and geospatial relationships. And it's nearly impossible to depict warfare without maneuver and spatial relationships. So a co-op war game with cards only would be even tougher. So why aren't there more co-op board war games? It's habit, I think. When people think about making a co-op, they think in Euro-style terms, not in war game terms. But it's definitely possible to make a co-op war game. And I've started several, but one is very far along. And I'll probably offer it to a publisher in 2019. Thanks for listening.